Hello, everyone. My name is William Anthony Hollis II, and welcome to my presentation on Mayer's Voice Principle, Enhancing Multimedia Learning. I chose this topic because I enjoy doing podcasts and music and all things to do with creative communication. Therefore, I felt that this topic was timely, especially as an educator with AI generated voices continually improving and with advances in technology. I felt that this topic would be worth exploring. So, first, before I begin, I would like to play an AI generated voice to see how you respond to it.
Mayer's voice principle is straightforward.
People learn better when real presenters rather than machines make voiceovers.
Although we are all used to Siri and Alexa, it seems we still prefer a friendly human touch.
How to apply the voice principle. This one is simple.
Narrate your own audio content or use a voiceover professional.
If doing it yourself, ensure you have a high-quality microphone and use audio editing software.
Now, I wanted to play that clip because if you notice, the suggestion is to use audio editing software. And one thing I noticed in even creating this presentation and working with the AI generated voice is that I still had to do a great deal of editing. I had to choose the correct voice and utilize the tone. There are also tools where you can choose the different types of emphasis and voice inflection and things of that nature. But getting back to the presentation, this is a core principle of Richard Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which, in his own words, have to do with how we process learning as far as words and pictures. So, as you can see, it suggests that people learn better from multimedia presentations when the narration is in a human voice rather than a machine voice, even though his research took place in 2014. And you'll see later on in the presentation where I examine an updated critique of his principle to see if the advances in technology could possibly challenge his initial premise. But as you can see, too, there is a focus on the importance of social cues and engagement in learning, which I would say that AI generated voices as of now fail to utilize. Also, part of this is based on the cognitive load. You'll see that there are three forms of cognitive load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. So we want to lessen the cognitive load overall, and we want to simplify intrinsic information. We want to reduce any extraneous or unnecessary information and then make sure that we maximize the deep processing. So, a lot of this has to do with whether or not machine learning adds to our cognitive load. And if it does, we want to be selective in how we use it. As far as a human voice versus a machine voice, keep in mind that these comparisons are based on machine voices from the early 2000s, the early 2010s. And as we all know, AI was not nearly as prevalent during those times. So listeners do perceive human voices as more conversational. And I know that this isn't the time for the discussion questions yet, but I want you to keep in mind and ask yourself, how conversational did those AI generated voices sound, the one that I played? Because I selected conversational and I used a platform called Murph AI to utilize that. And it says that human voices can express emotion and emphasis, aiding comprehension, and machine voices can be perceived as cold and disengaging. I would definitely say that in utilizing these tools that the voices have made progress as far as AI generated voices. But here's what's especially important is human voices can be cold and disengaging also. So regardless of what we use, we have to make sure that we are keeping the cognitive load of our listeners in mind. And with that, I will move to the next slide. Here is the study I was referring to. This was conducted by a Dr. Nazmi Dinshe, and his article is called The Voice Effect in Multimedia Instruction Revisited. Does it still exist? So, to summarize Mr. Dinscher's study, he rejected Mayer's principle that voices or that AI generated voices are completely inferior to human voices because Dr. Dinscher actually had a test group of subjects. They had to utilize both human voices and AI generated voices to deliver instructions for a 4-minute unit where they had to then take a test to demonstrate their comprehension of the 4 minutes of material. And this, what he did do though, was he did acknowledge that there were limitations because there was a small sample size. So he did acknowledge that with a larger sample size, there may be marketed differences between human voices and AI generated voices. Also, the length of the multimedia video, because it was a 4-minute video. One thing I can say from having observed it is that there's a difference between listening to simple instructions with an AI generated voice versus an entire presentation. And also, the test subjects or the sample size of individuals, they provided subjective grading scales. So that has an inherent bias where someone might severely overestimate or underestimate their own abilities or their own level of comprehension. As far as the psychology behind the principle, it makes perfect sense. Once again, the social agency theory states that humans respond to social cues, which is why it's been so imperative for AI generated voices to catch up in that regard, because I'm sure many of you remember how robotic voices sounded in the early 2000s. Also, as far as speaking with engagement, emotional engagement, it's important as educators or as instructional designers. We need to make sure that we utilize voices that evoke emotional responses so that it enhances memory. And it needs to be conversational. Even the AI platform had different settings where you could choose conversational, you could choose narration, you could even choose emotions such as sad or angry. Those weren't as genuine, but I believe that the technology will continue to catch up because there is an increased feeling of connection when you're hearing an AI or when you're hearing a human voice versus a computer generated voice. As far as applying the voice principle, use human voiceovers for explanations. That is why I am delivering this presentation, even though I was tempted to utilize AI just to see what the reaction would be. As far as video tutorials, we still want to prioritize human narration over synthetic voices because even with the advances in technology, we still notice that it is more effective to communicate person to person, if you will, and so that human voices can give feedback if you're utilizing interactive simulations. Also, the nuances of the voice principle. Voice quality does matter. And in some instances, I would say that AI can be beneficial because it may speak clearer, it may have a better pronunciation. However, it is a tool, and I don't believe that it's meant to replace a human presenter or a human who is delivering information. There are also cultural factors. So we want to keep voice preferences in mind. And one aspect of the principle did say that if we hire voiceover talent, that we need to keep those cultural factors in mind, even if we utilize another human, because voice actors have not been eradicated completely. Also, context is key. The content and audience definitely influences the effectiveness. Sometimes machine voices are needed, such as when you're generating large amounts of content. As far as myself, I would say that it's best to utilize it sparingly. Tips for effective human narration. This makes perfect sense, to be honest. We're going to want to use a natural conversational tone. We're going to want to vary the pitch and pace for emphasis. And I just want to point out that it is beneficial to utilize your own voice because even when I was using the AI platform, I had to spend a lot of time and energy to vary the pitch and pace. So, on the one hand, it may seem as though you're saving energy by using AI, But if you want to make it sound natural, you have to put energy into making it sound natural through the editing process. You do want to record in a quiet environment. You want to ensure clear pronunciation and articulation. And articulation is key too, because the AI doesn't necessarily have the nuances yet to get the right inflection on its own. You also want to match the tone of the voice to the content. That would be considered a best practice. Key takeaways: Meyer's voice principle highlights the importance of human narration, even as we continue to evolve. I would say that even in watching entertainment, I've watched documentaries that utilized the AI, it just doesn't sound as natural. It doesn't sound as natural. The AI generated voice, it definitely duplicates on a surface level. However, it doesn't resonate in the same way, which leads me to the next bullet point, which is that human voices enhance engagement, comprehension, and learning. And we want to make sure that we consider this principle when designing multimedia learning materials. And last but not least, we're going to want to use the voice that best fits the learning objectives. I would say that AI generated voices are most effective for short instructions where there's not too much information to be conveyed. As far as if information is, I would say, rote memorization, then we can definitely utilize AI for that. Now, for discussion questions, how do you see the voice principle evolving in the future? Do you think human voices will remain as a preferred medium, or could AI generated voices eventually become the norm for multimedia learning? There was a clip that I was going to add, which is of an AI song. I chose not to add it, but just be aware that there is AI that can generate music. It's actually now a new frontier as far as whether or not people can copyright their voices, because AI is progressing to the point where it can duplicate famous singers and actors. I'm sure you may have seen those platforms. I would say that speaking voices, it hasn't developed that far as the nuances. However, I notice a difference as far as duplicating the voices of celebrities. And then what specific differences do you notice between AI and human generated voices? And do you think there are any contexts where an AI generated voice is preferable? And in closing, these are my references that I utilized. Thank you so much for observing my presentation, and have a wonderful day or evening.